includes 2 attempted citizens' arrests of Robert Mugabe, fighting neo-Nazis in Moscow, and organising the first London Pride. Peter's going to discuss his incredible experience in LGBT plus activism throughout the AIDS epidemic, Section 28 and its repeal, and to introducing same-sex marriage a few years ago. So can we get a round of applause for Peter, please? Fantastic to have you joining us today. I was wondering if you could start out with like a brief introduction of your life and your works.
Well, I came out in 1969 at the age of 17 in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia, at a time when homosexuality in the state of Victoria was still a serious criminal offence, punishable by several years' imprisonment, and even the prospect of enforced psychiatric treatment. There were no gay organizations, no helplines, no counseling services, nothing. So coming out in that homophobic atmosphere was quite scary. And immediately when I realized that I was gay, I felt that the oppression of LGBT plus people was so very wrong. And I resolved that I wanted to do something in my own small way to help change that. In the absence of any LGBT organization to relate to, I myself tried to set up one. And all my friends said, "Oh, you're crazy. You'll get us all arrested. You're 17, what do you know? Go away." So I was very, very frustrated. And of course, this was in the period of late 1969. And I'd read a small report in, I think, one of the local newspapers, just a tiny news in brief, which said something like, "Thousands of homosexuals marched through New York last night to demand equal rights." I thought to myself, yes, that's what we need here in Australia, and we need everywhere on this planet. Now, I didn't have a template, but I had earlier been inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. At the age of 11, in 1963, I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. At the age of 11, I thought to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning? And that inspired my interest and motivation and inspiration with the Black Civil Rights Movement, with Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and to some extent Malcolm X. I saw their model of activism as the way forward. I read the history. I realized that for decades, African Americans had lobbied Congress, state legislatures, and the president to end segregation in the Deep South, to end the denial of voting rights to African Americans, and they got almost nowhere. It was only when they began nonviolent direct action, modeled on Gandhi, that things began to change. It's hard to imagine, but when I was growing up in many of the southern states, at big department stores and like Woolworths and so on, there were lunch counters reserved for white people only. No black person could get service. On trains, there were specific carriages which were white only. There were parks and beaches reserved for white people only. In fact, in the late or mid-1970s, I had a relationship with an African-American guy from Savannah in Georgia. And one day we went swimming at a beach. And he said to me, "Do you know that 10 years ago, no black person was allowed to swim at this beach?" His mother and others had to go there, defy the law, and get arrested, not once, twice, or 3 times, but many, many times, before the state authorities finally desegregated that beach. So for me, the Black Civil Rights Movement was the model, because I knew that the powers that be in Australia, Britain, the United States, they wouldn't listen, they wouldn't respond to the demands of LGBT plus people. And when the door is slammed in your face, when legislatures won't listen, then you've got a choice. Either you give up and walk away, or you up the ante. And the Black Civil Rights Movement showed how you successfully up the ante. How by using the moral, ethical power of nonviolence, being prepared to get arrested for your beliefs, to challenge unjust laws, that is the way in which social progress has been won all throughout history. So that was my template for LGBT activism. But also, I had no reference point about how to conceptualize LGBT plus activism. But in my own sort of young, immature mind, I thought to myself, well, if black people in America are an oppressed minority, then so are LGBT plus people. And if they have a claim for equal rights, then so do we. And we should learn from their experience. I'm a great believer in different movements learning from each other, supporting each other. I remember in 1969, towards the end, when I was just beginning my first tentative solo activism, working out in my head, well, based on the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement in America, it would probably take about 50 years to win LGBT plus equality in Western nations like Britain, the United States, and Australia. And that was a guesstimate, but it's turned out to be roughly about right. You know, we still have some things to resolve, like trans issues, but we've made huge, huge progress, and it's all been within the space of half a century. And that is extraordinary, given the millennia of persecution and oppression that we have faced. In half a century, in Western countries, we have overturned the straight supremacism that has held us down for millennia. That's a huge achievement by LGBT people and, of course, our straight allies and friends.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So I have a couple of questions. Obviously, you started out when being LGBT was criminalized and was incredibly persecuted. And I was wondering if you think the community now has lost the tradition of direct action. We see a lot about the commercialization of pride and participation of like banks and stuff. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose I should add the caveat that the criminalization of same-sex behavior between men only ended fully and finally in England and Wales in 2003, only in Northern Ireland in 2008, and only in Scotland in 2013. That's when the final residues of anti-gay laws were removed. So it's actually been quite recent, historically. Wow. And in fact, in the period after 1967, when there was a partial reform in England and Wales only, it wasn't extended to Scotland until 1980, and not to Northern Ireland until 1982, in that period after this partial decriminalization, the police repression actually intensified. The number of arrests of gay and bisexual men rocketed in the years after 1967. So if you compare 1974 with 1966, the year before partial decriminalization, in 1974, the number of gay and bisexual men being convicted for consenting adult same-sex behavior was 400% higher than in 1966.
Okay.
And even as recently as 2013, the police were going on trawls around the country, knocking on the doors of gay and bisexual men at 6 a.m. in the morning, men who'd been convicted in the 1980s, 70s, 50s, and 60s, and demanding they give a DNA sample to be put on Theresa May's special register of serious, violent, and sexual offenders. This was in 2013, and the police only stopped that witch hunt as a result of the campaign that I organized to shame and embarrass them, mostly using the media, but also lobbying various members of parliament as well.
So you think that the
I haven't answered your question, have I?
Has been less lost.
To answer your question, yeah, I mean, Pride today is very, very different from the first Prides. And obviously, society and culture evolves, our community evolves. But the trend towards commercialization and you pay a price to go to Pride, that's nothing to do with the original ethos of those of us who set up the first LGBT plus Pride parade in Britain in 1972. You probably know that in London, Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, who I broadly support, together with the Metropolitan Police Commissioner and the head of Westminster City Council, have imposed draconian restrictions on London Pride. They have said that a maximum of 30,000 people can march in the parade. And last year, over 50,000 people wanted to march, so 20,000 people were turned away. That's outrageous. There should be no cap on numbers. Pride should be open for everyone, LGBT and our straight friends and allies. You know, in the 1990s, there were over 100,000 people on Pride parades. It took 5.5 hours to pass through central London. On top of that, of course, I accept that there is a need for commercial sponsorship to pay for the festival and all those kind of things. That's fine. But commercial sponsors should be not dictating the terms and conditions. And last year, as in years previous, you went to London Pride, all the big floats were big commercial businesses. The community groups, the campaign groups, were almost invisible. Now, that is not the way Pride ought to be. And, you know, we really have to address a whole host of issues, you know, the underrepresentation of black and ethnic minority people, disabled people, trans people, non-binary and gender-fluid people. These segments of our community have often been marginalized and are still being marginalized today. And we need to address that if we're to have a truly inclusive Pride.
Absolutely. And just picking up on what you said about the backlash after partial decriminalisation, do you feel like we're almost seeing that now? Obviously, we've made massive progress recently, and we seem to have a kind of rise in social conservatism since 2016 and Trump, et cetera, Do you think we're going to see a similar kind of backlash, but to a lesser extent, or that we are seeing a similar backlash?
I think in Britain, at least, LGBT plus rights has been so embedded in our legal system and in our culture, I can't foresee any circumstance where things could be put into reverse. Obviously, there may be blocks on further progress. As you know, the government was due to make mandatory LGBT plus inclusive relationship and sex education in schools enforced from September this year. Under pressure, that has been put back to 2020. And even now, there are questions being asked whether the government is going to give exemptions to faith schools and some other independent schools. So the battles have not yet been fully won. And obviously the context of this is that 45% of young LGBT plus kids in schools say they've been bullied, ranging from teasing and name-calling to threats, harassment, and even actual physical violence. This is shocking, and it shows why mandatory inclusive relationship and sex education, plus education about rights in general for LGBT people, ought to be a part of every school curriculum, whether they're in the state sector, the state-funded sector, or independent sector. Every school in this country needs to work to overcome homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And we know that in schools where they do it, and some schools do it regardless of the government's indifference, the levels of anti-LGBT bullying go way, way down. The acceptance and inclusion of LGBT people, both staff and pupils, goes way up. So it's obvious what needs to be done. What is scary is that the government is equivocating.
So if we've seen a rise of social conservatism in some areas, but possibly not so much in LGBT areas, do you think that, as before, social movements are tied together? So like you took inspiration from like the Black Civil Rights Movement. Do you think now in our present day, all of these movements for social justice are as entwined as they were before?
Well, a lot of them are interlinked. You know, a traditional liberal or left critique of the government policy on austerity is that austerity is bad. And we know that within the LGBT community, austerity has had devastating effects, with a loss of funding for LGBT local community groups and support and campaign groups. So there used to be a gay bereavement project to support LGBT people who lost a partner. That's gone to the wall because the funding was withdrawn. There used to be lesbian and gay employment rights to help LGBT plus people who had victimization and discrimination in the workplace. The funding's been taken away. That organization no longer exists. Gallup, which monitors policing and police malpractice and homophobia, they're still going, but they're struggling. The number of LGBT plus organizations that exist today is a tiny fraction of what existed 20 or 30 years ago. Now, you could say, well, that's because we've made progress and they're no longer needed. But quite clearly they are needed because, the recent research shows that 1 million plus LGBT people in this country have been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime. 1 million plus, over a third of all LGBT plus people in this country. And when I say victims, I mean victims at least once, and if they're older, they've probably been victims 3, 4, or 5 times over their lifespan. So, there is no room for complacency. Of course, we should acknowledge the phenomenal changes. When you think about it, until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number, numerically, the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. Here we are, less than 2 decades later, and we have some of the best laws. That's an extraordinary achievement. When you think from 1999, with the end to the ban on LGBT plus people in the armed forces, to 2013 with the legislation of same-sex marriage, in that 15-year period, every major anti-gay law was repealed. Now, I can't think of any social reform movement in British history that has achieved so much in such a short space of time. And that's really an extraordinary acclamation to LGBT plus people and our straight friends and allies who have campaigned to make that change happen. We have achieved a phenomenal, extraordinary, unprecedented success in terms of law reform.
But in terms of, some of the LGBT community is obviously a lot more accepted than others, both socially and legally. And I think we see a lot of trans people, particularly trans women, facing a massive amount of cultural backlash. And I think it's interesting, whereas in comparison to America, it's very, widespread. In here, a lot of it is in the feminist movement with, trans exclusionary radical feminists. Why do you think there's this difference between transphobia almost in the UK and in America? And what can we do to support, our trans allies in this?
Well, I think there are two
main questions.
two elements of the LGBT that are underrepresented and have not been served well by the movement as a whole. Bisexual people and, of course, trans people. Both have been relatively invisible until recent times in our movement. Now, it wasn't always like this. Back in the days of the London Gay Liberation Front in the early 1970s, support for bisexual and trans people was very strong. Indeed, I was involved in protest campaigns where we occupied cafes and restaurants and bars that refused to serve trans people and successfully overturned those bans. I think after the demise of the Gay Liberation Front, there was a hiatus period of 2 or more decades, where trans sort of fell off the LGBT agenda.
Why do you think that was?
I think it's partly because a lot of the focus was on law reform, and there were no explicit laws against trans people. Partly because a more conservative generation came into the movement. And partly because some LGBT people are transphobic.
Absolutely.
Or they don't see the connections. I often get emails or messages on Twitter saying, why the F are you supporting trans people? They've got nothing to do with LGBT. Sexual orientation and gender identity are completely different, they say. My response is, no, they're not. They're intimately related because sexual orientation and gender identity are all tied up with perceptions, understandings, and so on of gender. We are all gender nonconformists. LGBT people don't conform to the expectations about opposite-sex relationships. Trans people don't conform to the expectations around gender and gender identity. So there's a commonality there. And I think, gender roles and expectations are key elements of our mutual oppression, and therefore we need to stand together. We're challenging gender orthodoxy, whether we're LGB or trans.
Absolutely. And I was wondering, why do you think this backlash has come in recent times in online communities like Mumsnet? I don't know if people here have followed the Mumsnet saga, and generally in the feminist movement, why that backlash has happened almost so suddenly.
Well, first of all, it's important to say that it's only a minority of feminists.
Absolutely.
There are loads of feminist individuals and organizations that support trans rights and have for many, many years. Last year I was at Hebden Bridge for Happy Valley Pride, and I went on a walk in the mountains, and one of the people with their present was a woman who worked for Halifax Women's Centre. I said to her, what's the stance of your organization towards trans people? And she said, we've accepted trans people for years. No problem. I said, well, what about the client? What about the other woman, the non-trans woman? They're completely relaxed. She said, this is a concocted, scaremongering story which has no basis in reality. So I'm really disappointed that there are some feminists, many of whom I greatly admire and have done fantastic work, have this really hostile view, this derogatory and bigoted and ill-informed view of trans people. I remember in the early days of the London Gay Liberation Front, we saw a very close correlation between homophobia and misogyny, that straight men were the mutual oppressors of women and LGBT plus people. And therefore we had a common cause in fighting for change. And in those days, the women's liberation movement used to say, biology is not destiny. In other words, the fact that you are born a woman doesn't mean that you will be destined to a certain particular life experience and life plan, that we as women, they said, we're out to challenge those expectations, those rules, those boxes into which women are put, and their humanity is undermined. So it used to be biology is not destiny. Now some of these same feminists say biology is destiny. If you're born or assigned a man at birth and you have male genitalia, you are a man, that you cannot be a woman. Well, that's a very reductionist, deterministic view of gender and gender identity. It reduces gender to genitals. And of course, gender is much more than that. In terms of gender, there's genitals as part of it, and biology is part of it, physical appearance is part of it, but also there's reproductive sex. Does the person have the capacity to reproduce? There's the whole issue of chromosomes and DNA. There's the issue of hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and so on. And then, of course, there's brain structures. I can remember way back in the early 1970s, when we were having debates about trans issues, I said, trans people believe this so strongly that there must be some differential in their brain structure. It's not delusional, they sincerely believe it. And of course, in the last couple of years, there's been 2 major studies which have indicated there are structural differences in the brains of trans and non-trans people. And this would indicate that when they say, despite being assigned male at birth, that I feel I'm a woman, I want to be a woman, this is not delusion or madness or insanity. It's rooted in their brains, and that is not surprising. We know that there are differences between gay and straight brains. I'm not saying they determine everything, but clearly there is research and evidence which shows that there is differences in certain aspects of gay and non-gay brains. So why shouldn't there be differences in between trans and non-trans brains? Now, of course, brain structures must never be used as an excuse to pigeonhole people and to force them into a particular set of life choices or behaviors. But clearly, they are influential. And I just think we need to be more open about this. I remember a couple of years ago, I was speaking at the Festival of Education, and Germaine Greer was speaking, and I tried to challenge her, but when I put my hand up, she said, another man, we're not having you, and then chose a woman. So I didn't get to challenge her in the public forum, but afterwards in the green room, I tackled her and said, look, you have this for someone of your experience and wisdom and knowledge, you have an incredibly reductionist view about gender identity. What about this issue of brain structures? She said, I've never heard of that. I said, well, look, here are I gave her references to the studies, and she said, actually, I will look into that. She suddenly got quite defensive. Now, I don't know whether she ever did look into it, and I haven't seen any statement she's made recently which indicates she has, but quite clearly she was taken by the fact that there is serious scientific evidence which suggests a difference in brain structures.
That's really interesting. And talking about you trying to communicate with Jermaine Greer on this, one of the big problems that FemSoc and LGBT plus people have had in Cambridge is how to reach out to people who wouldn't come to FemSoc meetings, who wouldn't read specifically feminist or gay news, but have the kind of average background knowledge. What would you suggest about reaching out to these kind of people before the trans misogynists do, almost? How do we engage with people who aren't naturally inclined to these issues?
Well, I disagree with a lot of trans activists who say, we don't want to debate these transphobes. Mm-hmm. I can understand why they say that. Emotionally, why should they have to justify themselves? But on the other hand, every successful social movement in history has been based upon challenging those who promote prejudice and bigotry. So in the 1970s and 80s, when the whole of media and public opinion was against LGBT plus people, I made a point of going every single radio, TV program I was invited to challenge these bigots. Mm-hmm. Not because I thought I could convince them, but because I thought, if I go on these programs, they'll be viewed or watched by perhaps millions of people who may share the views of this transphobic person or this anti-LGBT person, and hopefully I can demolish those arguments, produce the counter-evidence, and then persuade this listening or viewing public to change their view as well. So I think it's really important, although it may be emotionally quite difficult, to take on transphobes, homophobes, biphobes. I did a program, must have been maybe about 10 years ago, for Radio 4. It was a debate about trans issues, one of the very early debates. And Julie Bindel who's very critical of trans people. She doesn't act, contrary to what some people would say, she doesn't advocate discrimination or violence, as far as I know, but she does take otherwise a quite critical view. A lot of people said, don't do that program, you just give her a platform, you'll give her credibility. But my view was, if we don't challenge her ideas and put her ideas under the spotlight and dissect them and show why they're wrong, well, we probably won't convince her, but lots of people in the audience who perhaps share the same view might be persuaded. And so I did the debate, and I made sure there was a trans woman, Ros Kevney, part of the panel as well, so it wasn't just me. And in the end, the feedback from the program makers was that we won the argument hands down. And indeed, the responses from the audience indicated that. I mean, Julie Bindel got a little bit of a clap, but we got huge applause. And the feedback online and various other ways, they said that overwhelmingly the responses were in favor of trans rights. So I think it shows the importance of challenging transphobes.
So you think the best way to convince the kind of passive observer is to have these kind of showy debates? Obviously that's really useful in places like the Union, where we have the resources to do this stuff. But what about your average person, your average student in Cambridge? What's the best way for them to do this when they might not necessarily have the resources to invite in speakers, do you think? Real grassroots action?
Well, I guess at a very basic level, the most important thing of all is that we don't allow transphobic comments to pass unchallenged, that we question them, that we challenge them, that we seek to try and persuade that person why they're wrong. And a lot of people can be persuaded. Maybe there are some people who can't, but in my experience, whether it be about women's rights, black rights, or LGBT plus rights, there are lots of people who've just imbibed the consensus of centuries, without thinking, but when you present the counter-evidence, when you demolish the arguments of those who support prejudice, a lot of those people come around. So I think it starts with person to person, that we stand up against bigots and we support and defend trans people.
Do you think generally in society we've moved to a kind of position where it's so polarized that if like challenging or controversial people are invited to speak, they'll only be invited to an organization where the audience will already support them? Do you think do you think that's fueling the no platforming debate in society nowadays? Like the actual format of event and the groups who are inviting, do you think that's changed?
Yeah, I think that a lot of groups tend to invite speakers who conform to their particular outlook, which is fine. We can, there are some outstanding speakers on trans issues or LGBT issues or race and gender issues, and they should be heard. But I think it's also really good to have contrary speakers so that ideas are challenged and so there can be a genuine debate. And I think if you're just going to have a meeting which is just pro-trans, you're probably only going to get people who are already committed to trans issues and support. Whereas if you have a debate with some anti-trans people, then probably you'll get more neutral or perhaps even anti-trans people in the audience, and the hope might be that in the process of the debate, you change those hearts and minds.
Interesting, yes. So moving on slightly to your past activism, I was intrigued by.
Can I just finish by saying,
absolutely.
just a slight before we move on. To me, the whole issue, or all the issues raised by trans people, by gender fluidity, by non-binary identification, this is a phenomenal revolution in gender. It is turning traditional ideas on their head. It's saying, no, we don't want to be put in these tight, prescribed boxes of male and female, masculine and feminine. We want to accept that most, or perhaps all of us, are a mixture of male and female, masculine and feminine, gay and straight. And this breaking down of barriers, to me, is an awesome, inspiring movement. And I'm just sad that there are some people, particularly some feminists, who can't see this revolution and the incredible importance it is in terms of human liberation. It's going beyond what has gone before so that we can all be who we want to be. And that was one of the main battle cries of the Gay Liberation Front in the early 1970s. Yes, it was primarily focused on LGBT plus rights, but we also said we want to create a sexual revolution, a democratic sexual revolution, which will benefit not just us, but will also benefit straight people as well. To create a commonality between us and those who have traditionally oppressed us. To show them a path forward where we can all gain and all benefit.
Absolutely, yes. And back onto your kind of past activism, but this does link into things that are happening now. I was intrigued by the Secret Gay Lives project you did, which was outing people who were homophobic in public life, who were secretly gay. I was wondering, what you thought of the ethical, backing for this. And obviously this happens still in America with politicians who, not just who are gay, or whose family members have had an abortion or they're passing anti-abortion policies. Do you think this is a tactic that should continue into these other areas and into this age?
I would say that outing is a very useful ethical weapon when used with a moral purpose. So outrage, the LGBT plus group that I was involved in the 1990s, which I think is one of the most extraordinary groups to have existed in social activism in British history. For 21 years, no funding, no staff, all volunteer, hundreds of people arrested, extraordinary. I think looking at how outrage approached these issues, we always said that to get change, you need to be prepared to take risks. And obviously outing was a risk, a highly provocative, confrontational, and very, very controversial tactic. And it came about because we were fed up of being kicked around by hypocrites politicians and church leaders who would denounce homosexuality despite their own secret gay lives. Now, of course, they're not the only bad guys, but they're the people who should have known better. Having lived the experience of being gay and the oppression and discrimination and prejudice, far from colluding with it, they should have been leading the fight against it. So it was a weapon to try and defend our communities. Now, Outrage did not adopt outing just like that. I can remember we discussed outing for probably 6 or 9 months in the group. And initially, the majority, including myself, were opposed to outing. But over time, with the internal debates, we eventually got an 80% plus consensus that this was the right tactic.
What were your
But
reasons
it was targeted on homophobes and hypocrites. And we only really used it twice. One was outing the 10 Anglican bishops in 1994, simply calling them to tell the truth, which is what they preach from their pulpits every Sunday, but weren't doing themselves. And then again, 2 years later, when we wrote to 20 members of parliament who'd voted against gay equality to demand that they either cease their support for anti-LGBT plus discrimination, or we would out them. So we gave them due notice. Now, I'm glad to say that we never needed to do anything further, because some of those MPs on receipt of that letter suddenly stopped voting against equality, and some even began voting in favour of equality. So it worked for the most part. And with regard to the bishops, as far as I know, none of those 10 bishops ever again said anything that could be construed as support for church policy against the LGBT plus community. They just either remained silent, or in the case of 2, later on became quite strong supporters of the LGBT plus community. I remember some of them said to me at the time, or soon afterwards, being outed like that was hell. But actually, it lifted a burden. They didn't have to look over their shoulder anymore. They could be themselves, more or less.
What do you think was the tipping point that took the group from being opposed to outing to being pro it?
I think it was the realization, first of all, that these people were just impervious to reason and compassion. They wouldn't dialogue, they wouldn't budge. Plus, there was just the general view that, well, if they're saying to us, as LGBT plus people, that they can invade our privacy by demanding our criminalization, by demanding the right of employers or landlords to sack us or evict us, if they're prepared to invoke discrimination against us, which is an intrusion on our privacy, then they forfeit the right to privacy, particularly when, or solely when they're being hypocritical, when they're speaking in public saying one thing, but in private doing something else.
Interesting. No, it's really interesting to see how views on that changed. And I was wondering, with your other work, you've been involved in gay activism in lots of different countries, and obviously that presents difficulties with accusations of, say racism and anti-Semitism. How have you overcome the challenges of, the different cultural barriers and moving from, the British cultural scene to other areas?
Well, right from the very beginning, back in the late 60s, I always saw the struggle for LGBT plus rights as being a global one. Mm-hmm. I never saw it purely in Australian, British, or American terms. I said, we can't rest until every LGBT plus person on this planet is free and equal. So that prompted me to argue that, as well as fighting our own battles here in Britain, we should do actions in support and solidarity with LGBT activists in other countries. Mm-hmm. So it's always been motivated by solidarity with struggles in other countries, not about dictating how they should run their battles, but support the battles they are already fighting. Mm-hmm. So I remember the first such protest was in 1971. I organized a picket of the Cuban embassy in London in protest at the Castro government's witch hunt against LGBT plus people. The Communist Party had designated that homosexual people should be sent to re-education camps to make them straight. And lots of very quite prominent Cuban communists and cultural and literary figures were sent off to these labor camps. Shocking. But in response to their appeal, they were saying, we can't do anything in Cuba. We need you to protest, to embarrass and shame and force the Castro government to change its policy. So we did the picket, and many other ones following in other countries. And eventually, the Cuban government did change. And indeed, Castro eventually apologized for that persecution in the 70s.
So the best way of doing it, you'd say, is to work with groups already established in those countries and just aid them in what they're doing.
Yeah. But in the case of Cuba, there weren't any groups, but there were individuals
who reached out,
who reached out and told us the story of what was happening and pleaded for help and support. So I think, it's always the case. We need to listen to and learn and support movements overseas, not seek to impose a Western model. And there are still many, many countries, 69 around the world, that still have a total criminalization of same-sex relations. That's over a third of the world's countries. And in every single case that I've dealt with, they want and value international solidarity. And it really annoys me and angers me, in fact, the way in which some mostly very intellectual, rarefied types criticize this solidarity as neocolonialism or imperialism or racism or whatever. Outraged at the big Stop Murder Music campaign in the early part of this century against 8 Jamaican dancehall and reggae singers who were advocating and singing lyrics urging the killing of LGBT plus people, saying we should be burned, hanged, drowned, and so on. The Jamaican LGBT group J-Flag appealed for Western LGBT organizations to support their campaign against these singers. Apart from outrage, no other LGBT group in the world responded to their call. They were all too cowardly and gutless because they feared being denounced as racist or neo-imperialists. But we knew in outrage that we had a duty of solidarity. In Jamaica, they couldn't campaign because they'd be killed. That's why they needed international solidarity. And we organized that campaign. Initially, we tried to dialogue with the singers. They refused. So we organized a global boycott campaign to cancel their concerts and to get contracts and deals withdrawn. That was incredibly successful. Some of them lost millions. And that eventually forced them, money talks, forced them to negotiate and to sign an agreement whereby they wouldn't use homophobic lyrics and language. All but one of the 8 signed. Initially, all of them conformed, and then some of them rode back and reverted to their bad old ways. So then we resumed the campaign against them. But the upshot is that, as a result, this murder music is very marginal in Jamaica now. Because the artists know that if they do it, they will lose contracts, they'll lose concerts. And so it shows the power of boycott. Again, modeled exactly on the Black Civil Rights Movement. Boycott white institutions that are racist. Well, this was boycotting singers who are not merely homophobic, were actually inciting the murder of LGBT plus people, which is a criminal offense in Jamaica and indeed around the world. The Jamaican group, LGBT group, J-Flag, says that at the time of these songs coming out in the period 2002, 3, 4, there was a huge escalation in homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic violent attacks, including the murder of people like Brian Williamson, one of the leaders of the J-Flag movement, was brutally stabbed to death in his home. An obeying mob stood outside chanting, "Boom, bye, bye," and a batty boy head, "Kill the fucking queer." But we changed that. We changed that culture in collaboration with J-Flag. And even to this day, there are people, mostly academics, people aloof from reality, who denounce us as racist. There was no racism. We weren't targeting people because of their race or their nationality. It's because they were anti-LGBT. In the same way that a black person should challenge and defeat white racism, or women should challenge and defeat patriarchy. I mean, our movement has got a lot of people who are really screwed up. No, not a lot of people. Some people who are very screwed up. And this critical, ignorant, bigoted, critical approach is actually undermining the movement. I know so many people who have been fantastic activists, who've been driven out of the movement by this sort of these rarefied academics and far-left people who denounce them. So in Outrage, we had a fantastic gay Muslim spokesman, Ramzi Islam, who was a refugee from Algeria. He'd been targeted for assassination because he was gay by the GAA, one of the main Islamist groups in Algeria. We helped him get asylum here in Britain, and as a payback, he was committed to be our LGBT plus Muslim spokesperson. He challenged Islamist extremists. He challenged Ken Livingstone when Ken Livingstone, our left-wing leader, invited Yusuf Qaradawi to City Hall in London and hosted him. This man who said vile anti-Semitic tropes, who was an out-and-out misogynist, who said that Muslim men should have the right to beat their wives, who supported female genital mutilation, who implied that women who didn't dress conservatively got what they deserved if they were raped. And this man was invited and hosted by Ken Livingstone in City Hall. When we challenged it, we were denounced as racist, as Islamophobes. And Ramzi Islam led the fight as a gay Muslim himself to challenge that. The vicious, vile, hateful stuff said against him almost drove him to a mental breakdown. He ended up getting out of politics, getting out of LGBT activism because of the way he'd been treated. And I can tell you hundreds, at least dozens or scores of similar stories of great, inspiring, courageous activists who've been driven out of the movement by people falsely making accusations of Islamophobia, racism, neocolonialism, etc.
So why do you think this separation between almost like the gay academic sphere, or the academic sphere in general, and the gay activist movement, do you think this is something that has developed, or do you think it's always been there, and what we can do to kind of redress it? Because I think like contemporary queer theory is something that I thought came rather from the bottom up, at least at the beginning of the movement. I was wondering what your thoughts on this were.
All these people who claim to be queer theorists, in nearly every case, they've simply stolen and renamed and reworded the ideas of the Gay Liberation Front. Between them, they've hardly got an original idea. What they've done is they've taken the ideas, they've turned them into obscure, obtuse academic language to make them look superior and intellectual. But the ideas originated from grassroots activists, not from academics. I look at queer academics and I think, shit. With a few exceptions, they are shit. They never helped us when they had a chance to. In the 1970s and 80s, queer academics could have researched to show the level of criminalization of the LGBT community.